Okay. Apologies for that technical glitch. Before I start, I was just wondering, I'm managing to speak to some of you about how you feel the sugya is going. I haven't given out my own comments because there's enough just to see in Gemara Rashi Tosfos, and I'm actually almost tempted to say to those who are struggling in the sugya, and I include myself in that category, to miss out Tosfos. And I think for now, even if we're just getting through Gemara Rashi, that's a success. The warning I gave at the beginning of Muktza is it very swiftly becomes overwhelming. There's just too much to think about, too much to see. I'd like to carry on just plodding through the Gemara for now, but at some point we can do a bit of a vote and see whether we want to carry on if we're finding it Muktza too overwhelming. If possible, I would like to do a few duff of it, even if we then move on, and spend a few months on it. Going through the whole of Muktza is probably a 2-3 year project, but it'd be nice if we just spent at least a few months and dipped our toes into it and became familiar with the main concepts. But I apologize for the complexity of the subject. It's a very conceptual set of halacha. Okay, so I think for now we covered with reasonable depth the issue of nitzotzos. So I'm actually going to move on from that. Just to summarize, the mitzias first, the facts of the case seem to be that these nitzotzos, these sparks, aren't just a spark, but they actually form some sort of ash layer in the utensil, the kli, and therefore in theory the kli should become a bossis. Rashi says that the nitzotzos are not mukta because they are so trivial. The Magen Avraham says but ash is mukta. He doesn't understand that there's a difference between ash and just soot, very fine powder. He doesn't think that's a good distinction, and therefore he says ash is mukta. Rashi says this soot cloud is not mukta, and therefore it doesn't make a bossis. And the Magen Avraham says that ash is mukta, but even though it's mukta, it doesn't make a bossis because it's not choshev enough to make the kli a bossis. The point of a bossis is that it redefines the functionality of the utensil. The utensil is subservient to that which is what it's holding. That's the point of being a kli. And therefore the kli is now dedicated to a mukta function, and therefore the kli itself becomes a bossis. Says the Magen Avraham with ash, even though ash is mukta, the kli doesn't become subservient to it because it's so trivial, and therefore the kli doesn't become a bossis, and therefore it's not Mevatel kli MeHechano. That was point number one. Point number two that we had, which I spent a lot of time thinking about, I think Josh's svara, and upon a great deal of reflection, I think it's a very good svara. And we asked on the previous Gemara about what defines kli nittel, the tzorech davash ein nittel. Am I moving the utensil for the sake of what am I moving the utensil for the sake of? I mean, in the case of the delaf, the drip, in the case of the nitzotzos, I'm not moving it because I want the dirty water. I'm not using it because I want the sparks or the ash. I'm moving it because I want to protect something. Nonetheless, the Gemara considers that to be using a Keli for something, because I'm using it, the function, the direct proximate thing I'm using the utensil for is to hold rainwater, is to hold sparks, and therefore that's called using a Keli for a function of davash ein nittel. Therefore, the Gemara earlier asks from nitzotzos. On the earlier Gemara, it can't, according to the Magen Avraham, it can't answer that the ash is not choshev and doesn't make a bossis, because who cares whether it makes a bossis? The first answer to the Gemara is not about whether it makes a bossis or not. It was whether I'm moving something for davash ein nittel. Our Gemara, which is talking about bossis, it can answer that ash is not choshev enough to make a bossis. In Rashi's version, our Gemara can answer the ash doesn't, when it stops being a spark and becomes ash, is no longer mukta. But in the earlier Gemara, the point isn't whether it stops being mukta. The point is at the moment of putting the utensil there to catch it, I'm doing it to catch something which is mukta, which are the nitzotzos. So that's a summary of the two sugyas. Is that reasonably clear? Okay, happy to discuss it further if anyone wants. Okay, so that's that I think brings us to an end to that line in the Gemara. The Gemara then says, "Korash nishbra somchen ois v'sasser baruchas amita." So a beam that's broken and one wishes to prop up the beam. I think the scenario is we're talking about a beam in a roof, and one wants to prop up the beam to stop the roof collapsing, and you use a bench or a bed, posts, whatever it is, to prop up the beam. So l'chora, you're making the bed or the bench a bossis to the beam, and therefore should it be also because of Mevatel kli MeHechano. And that the Gemara answers to Rafi, it's loose. If you want, you can take it. So what's the answer of the Gemara over here? Why is this a reason that it shouldn't become Muktza? So I'm going to suggest 2 or 3 reasons. One of them built on an outside discussion, which we've mentioned again and again, but we haven't gone into in depth. And the other one's just from trying to think through this Gemara. One possible answer to this question is that since it's loose, the explanation of the Gemara is you're not planning to leave it there. And therefore it's a temporary bosses. And this gets us into the discussion about whether there's such a thing as a temporary bosses. I've mentioned again and again the minority opinion of the Bal Hamar, that temporary bosses isn't called Mevatel Kli MeHechano. We're not going to go into that. Just every time we see it, because it keeps on creeping up again and again. So yeah, I'll just flag it. If I'm planning to only leave something there temporarily, does it make it a bosses and does it become Mevatel Kli MeHechano? Interesting debate. Mainstream opinion is yes, it still is Mevatel Kli MeHechano, even though it's only there for an amount of time. But that's how the Bal Hamar reads the Gemara, just for general knowledge. He says the point of the Gemara is it's loose, and therefore it's not a great way of propping up the beam, and you're not planning to leave it there. You're planning to remove it as soon as you can get round to it. So that's the view of the Bal Hamar. Maybe it's not a bosses at all, or is a bosses, but it's not Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because it will cease to be a bosses according to the Bal Hamar as soon as you move it. Okay, that's opinion. But let's leave that aside. What might the Gemara mean? Now, one way of understanding the Gemara, I was thinking, ties into Tosfos that we did discuss before, because Tosfos before says that, or the Gemara really, the Gemara says that since you can tithe tevel be'issa, it doesn't make Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because you can tithe the tevel, and then it will cease to be tevel and cease to be Muktza. In which we then asked a question, but you can always transgress the laws of Muktza and remove the entity that's causing it to be Muktza. If you have a plate with an egg, that you catch an egg of, you can't put the plate there to catch the egg of the Tanagodas. Well, why not? You can be over the Is of Muktza, move the egg, and then the plate will cease to be a bosses for the item inside it. So what does it help that you can move the that you can move it? How does that help? So the answer we gave was that if you have a Keli with an egg that lands in it, let's go according to Rashi's reasons for the sake of simplicity. So this is Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because it is either boiner because you're fixing the plate to the ground, or it's sosa because you're destroying the utensil because you're making it Muktza by making it a bosses. So very clever, you can now remove the egg. So all you're doing is doing another look-alike malacha. You're detaching the plate from the ground, or you're reconstructing it as a Keli. Nothing has been achieved. The whole point is that it looks like when you put a Muktza item inside it, it seems to be a type of boner or a type of sosa. It's a bit like, you can attach a Keli to the ground with cement. You can also remove the cement and detach it. That doesn't stop it being a melacha on Shabbos. In contrast to tevel, where it's true it'd be an issa to tithe it, but you're not doing anything physical to the utensil. You're simply removing the very thing within it that made it Muktza without any external change of circumstances. That's where the Gemara says this wouldn't make it Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because you're unraveling it in a more internal manner. Sorry. Go. Sorry, which case is undoable? Yes. It is very reversible, but the only way, but the Chiddush of Mevatel Kli MeHechano, according to Rashi's understanding, is that since it's only reversible by removing the egg, it looks like it's fixing the egg in its place. And therefore this is called Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because there's something mechanical or physical that's holding the egg in the Keli in place, and therefore this looks like a bone of sorts. It's fixing it in its place halachically. Whereas with tevel, there your svara is correct. It's reversible with zero action. There's nothing physical there. That's too far removed from bona. So this is a possible reading in our Gemara also, that since it is rofi, meaning it's not in any way weighed down at all by the object that's leaning on it. Therefore, there's no, at this point, bona and sosa would cease to be a meaningful concept. And as an egg is also very roughy. How hard is it to tip an egg out of a container? But nonetheless, I am doing a misa niur. I'm doing a misa of tipping something over, of shaking something out. Whereas with the beam, one way of reading the answer of the Gemara is it's super trivial. It's just sitting underneath the beam, but there's no lineage at all. I'm suspecting, by the way, that I'll come to a moment ago. I'm suspecting that Shiur is what the Gemara is saying is that the beam isn't actively falling where I'm literally holding it up, because that wouldn't be roughy. It's I'm scared the beam will fall further, so I put something underneath it, but it's barely touching it. It's sort of, and if I pull it out, there'd be no movement at all of the beam, and therefore, and maybe not much friction either, not much. And the Gemara is saying this crosses the threshold, there's nothing moved. So the egg inside the cup is very easy to tip eggs out. It's not a big deal, but nonetheless, I'm making a constructive change. And on that, Rashi says, not like your svara, and then say that's a change, that's fixing it in its place. But you're right, the whole din of Mevatel MeHechano is a chiddush. It's not cement. I found it very funny, by the way, that anyone would look at this and think this is Bono or Zosa. It seems they saw Muktza as more of a halachic reality than we do, perhaps to our loss. They saw Muktza as literally, it's like stuck down with cement. You know, Rashi says it several times on the Torah, where the verb lo yochel, you're unable, refers to an issa. If you really internalize an issa, it's not that you're not allowed to do it, it's that you can't do it. So they apparently they saw Muktza as literally it's destroyed the utensil, it's literally fixed the utensil in its place, and therefore it's asa. But that's where there's something there structurally that causes it. Whereas here, where it's roughy, or in the case of Tevel, where it can be unraveled with no physical change whatsoever, that's going too far, and therefore there's no Mevatel MeHechano. That's what seems to be one possible reading in the Gemara. Sorry, Karen.
Could you say that this is actually a fundamentally different case? Because in all the other examples, you've got something that's definitely Muktza, and it creates a Masechet Shabbat, and all of the arguments are then saying, well, actually, it's not Muktza, and therefore it's not a Masechet. Yeah, maybe the chaburah is not Muktza in the first place. And this is because we're talking about MeHechano, you are literally taking something and making it unusable. There's nothing to do with Muktza whatsoever. And the answer here is that, well, since you could remove it, you've not actually fixed it in its place. So it's a different application of melachot.
If so 2 points over here. First of all, chaburah is understood to be Muktza in other cases. That's just a bit of background knowledge. The second case is if the bed was literally fixed under the beam as a permanent prop to hold the beam up, and it was genuinely fixed its place, albeit removable perhaps, but with difficulty, you would actually be heading towards Boina min HaTorah. It wouldn't be Mevatel MeHechano, it would be literally a Boina of sorts. If you
But it says in the Mishnah later on, Rashi, this example, of course,
yeah,
Rashi says there's as long as you're preventing further deterioration and you're not lifting the beam,
yes, that's because it's not a permanent structural change. If it's a permanent structural change, that would be enough. Yeah. In fact, that Rashi is where I'm coming from in thinking that maybe one explanation of the Gemara is it's not leaning at all, really. It's just there as a precaution. It's a bit further than Rashi. It's not that it's stopping further deterioration. It says there's no weight on it at all. That's what the Gemara means when it says Rafi. And therefore, when I move it, I don't see this as fixing or unfixing something at all. If it'd be permanently fixed in place and holding it up, albeit only to stop further deterioration, that would be, that's an act of building. I mean, if you build a pillar, I think that would be literally Boina.
Nevertheless, that's what Rashi says here. That's exactly what Rashi says. The
I think any yochel shavlitloi means in the Hilchas Muktza and in the level in which it's muhuduk. Before the Gemara says it's rofi, it means it's tightly there. I don't think it means you're planning permanently to leave it there. If you're literally planning to leave it permanently there, then there seems to be this is boina. I mean, that's putting a pillar up or something.
You're only supporting. You know what we said, the Rashi on the other page says it's not. You're not pushing it up, you're just stopping it from going down.
If it's pressing down hard and it's stopping it falling, even though it's only stopping it falling further, and you're putting it there as your permanent solution to your building problem, then as far as I can see, that is literally fixing something to the ground. And in the Havmin of the Gemara that's pressed tight, and if the Gemara meant it's literally unmovable, that l'chora would be mamash boina. That would be literally boina. That's not a new sugam of Mevatel MeHechano. You know, you're removing it from its preparedness. That's boina. I mean, that's putting a pillar in place, fixing something to the ground. If it's so heavily weighed that it's like cemented to the ground, as far as I can see, that would be boina.
Then what's the b'chein in the Mishnah? The b'chein, if you took it as the case, they was comparing it to the Mishnah there about the mace with the mouth half opening and tying it. That's exactly what's happening. It started out and got prevented at all. something's happened, and you're tying it to stop it getting worse. So the B'chein, the Mashmos there is that something's happened here, and you're putting the bed stool in or something to stop it getting worse. Exactly that.
So you're asking the other way around. You're not asking that you're fixing in place because of regular boner. You're asking me who's saying it's just to stop something more happening.
Yes.
So stopping something happening can mean one of two things. I'll tell you where I'm coming from. In a sense, I'm not even coming here from the Londers yet. If the explanation is that it's roughy and it can be easily slid out, to me that means mathematically it's not pressing down, which seems to mean that either it's just a very, very, very gentle, gradual weighing down, or it's preventative in case it shifts and things begin moving. I just don't understand the physics of it. How can it be roughy and yet literally be about to fall unless I would put this beam there? Which is why I'm understanding the stopping here to mean preventative rather than, preventative can mean two things. Preventative can mean preventative because if you remove it, it will instantly crush to the ground, or preventative because in the long run it will fall to the ground and therefore it's there as protective. I'm understanding the answer to the Gemara of roughy to literally be shifting from these two forms of preventative. It's not a tight thing because it's pressing down and I'm literally propping it up. It's a loose thing because it would very gradually would slip, and I want to prevent that occurring. Forget any londers in the sugya. I just what's the physics of roughy? What's the Gemara saying when it's saying it's roughy? Before any svara. So maybe I should have laid it out like this. I was just struggling to understand the mitzias, and I think it meant that it is that it's loose because it's preventative in the weaker form of the word rather than the stronger form of the word. In others, it's stopping it falling, but not that it's pressing down against it.
I find it hard to read that into the later Mishnah.
The Gemara agrees with you. The Gemara's Havamina was that it's tighter preventative, probably because of the chain in the sequence. The Gemara's answer is that the weaker preventative is also similar enough. I mean, they're both preventative. Till I learned this Mishnah, I never thought about different meanings of the word preventative at all. I mean, forget Lomdus. Maybe I'm making a mistake here. Before I went straight into the svara of what's going on, I should have spoken about what's the mitzias of roughy. I understood the mitzias of roughy to mean it's literally loose, which means it's not pressing down heavily on it, which I understood to mean it's not actively in the process of falling and literally being propped up, because otherwise it would press down. That's what I understood Gemara to mean, wrong or rightly.
Coming back to the question of Mevatel melachot, does that always have to be that it's a Muktza process issue? So I thought conceptually Mevatel melachot means you have a Keli at the beginning of Shabbos that has one intended purpose, and you change that purpose, and therefore it's no longer available for the original purpose. It could be that there are other examples,
right?
Other types of situations that don't involve something that's Muktza becoming a boss.
I'm nervous to answer your question other than tentatively. I think Mevatel melachot is a unique term to refer to one particular way of destroying a Keli, which is through the conceptual idea of Muktza and bosses. If you literally dysfunction a Keli, then you'll be heading towards literal sosa or literal boner, which is in a way what I answered you when I said if you're literally fixing it in place, it'd either be deraisa or a different drabanon of literally fixing things in place. If you build a pillar on Shabbos that literally holds up a building, then that's either a deraisa or a regular drabanon of boner, because that literally is boner. So the term of Mevatel melachot, I think, means I'm not able. We had a Shachter here last week who probably has gone through Shas and done a quick scan whether it's ever used in that context. But unfortunately, I'm not able to do that. So, but I think that Mevatel melachot is not used in that way. It's only used in this context. Yeah.
But we're just thinking more about that. We were thinking of exactly what you're talking about. If forgetting the fact that it might be boner, if you had jammed it in so it wasn't usable as a bed anymore, it would actually, besides not usable as a bed, it would be Muktza. It would be, admittedly, it wouldn't be Muktza as a bosses. It would be Muktza because anything which is useless to you is probably Muktza, just that the beam is Muktza in the first place. So I think we could still say that it was Mevatel melachot because you made it Muktza.
It's an interesting point.
It's just, I think if we could figure out why it isn't boner, then it would feel a much, to me, sorry, it would feel a much nicer way than the longest arm that you were coming out before with.
I thought you were an ally till that last comment. I don't see any contradiction between what you're saying and what I'm saying. I think what you're saying is a very nice point, but it's on a different tier to what we're talking on. I hadn't occurred to me your point, to be honest, but unless I'm missing something, I don't see why it unravels what I'm saying. I'm hearing your point of saying something else, which is even bosses aside, actually a really interesting comment, even bosses aside, so I'm just muting, even bosses aside, if you literally make it into a beam, then it would be Muktza because it's a beam of the house, and the same as a Korah is Muktza, a beam is Muktza. And that raises really interesting questions about at what point does a Kli, imagine I have a bedpost and I literally use it there to keep my house up and no roughly at all. It's literally the thing holding the roof up, and my plan is to leave it there forever and ever, and that's the new beam of the house. So it's a really interesting question around repurposing objects, right? But l'chora, let's say you're right, and it now becomes a koros. It would be muktza as a korah, and maybe also right there would be another form of mevatel ki MeHechano, because my answer to Karen was mevatel ki MeHechano is only when you make something muktza. Normally, something becomes muktza because of bosses, but here it becomes muktza because it's become a korah. That would be the same maybe. In fact, we saw two nuschos of Rashi. If I can just find my Makoma's sheet quickly. We saw Rashi by us says Muktza. The reason is Muktza. It becomes Muktza, and Rashi in Mem Zayin on the base says it's because it becomes a bosses. So at the time I didn't focus on the difference between the two words, but maybe that's something around this. Okay, so this is an interesting point. Does the Kli become a beam, in which case it becomes Muktza? Nice question. But what I'm saying is something else, which is at the end of the day, what is the Gemara's answer? Why doesn't it become a bosses? And the Gemara's answer is because it's Rafi. And I understood, wrongly or rightly, Rafi to mean that it is loose. The physics, the mechanics of that I understood to mean that it's when we say it's preventing the roof from falling, it means very slowly or the risk of it falling rather than literally propping it up. And the svara, I understood what that is because you can move it without doing anything. Now, even if my whole lomdas is wrong and my understanding of Rafi is wrong, and your svara is wrong and your svara is right, all of that aside, the very words of the Gemara is that it should be a bossis and mevatel ki MeHechano, and the answer to the Gemara is Rafi, which is it's so easy to move, easier than an egg to move. Now, why is it easier than an egg to move? What can possibly be easier than an egg to move? The answer is it's true, an egg is very easy to move, but I'm moving something. Whereas Rafi, I'm moving nothing. That's my suggested reading in the Gemara, and therefore it's even less than a bossis. If everything else I've said is wrong, that line chura is a reasonable reading in the Gemara.
Isn't the case of putting it loosely? Isn't this similar to you put a kli under the tarnagolas, and then you remove it before an egg's landed in it?
If you remove it before an egg lands, it never became bossis.
Exactly, and I think it isn't what Rav Yosef's response is. You haven't been mevatel kli MeHechano because it's not actually supporting anything. It's simply a preventative measure. In the same way that when you put the kli under the tarnagolas, you haven't been mevatel until an egg hits it or lands in it, rather.
I hear what you're saying. I was in a way I was saying a similar thing, but a more moderate version of that, which is even though it is technically the beam is resting on it, it's such a mild rest that there's no movement by putting it out, and therefore that's not mevatel ki MeHechano, because in a moment I'll come to your svara, which I'm never going to go quite as far as you're saying. You're saying it's so preventative, there's not resting on it at all. The Gemara to me doesn't say it's not resting on it at all. It says it's Rafi. So I thought I could dance between the raindrops, and Rafi could mean there is a contact here. It is resting on it, but it's so loosely resting that there's no movement at all when I remove it, and therefore that doesn't fall under mevatel kli MeHechano. An egg is a very light thing, but in the context of a very little light egg, there's movement. When it's very easy to do nior, but at the end of the day, I'm doing nior. Nior means tipping something off. Whereas with a beam, there's no nior at all. There's no tipping something off, and therefore I understood that to be the answer of the Gemara. And I think, in all modesty, it's a good reading of the Gemara, whether everything else I said is wrong or not. I jumped to the conclusion that this was preventive or just a very slow movement. That's how I understood the physics of the Gemara. But wrong or right, one way of reading the Gemara is it's so roughy that there's no movement whatsoever, and therefore that's not mevatel ki MeHechano. That's my suggestion.
One last associated question. Let's say you take a chair and you put books on it during Shabbat. You can't sit on the chair with the books. So is that not mevatel ki MeHechano?
No, because there's no muktza, no bossis.
no longer that chair is no longer used.
On the contrary, it's used for something. It's doing exactly what kalim do, which is to contain things. It's putting things on it.
So even an unusual, unthinkable use of something.
So here we get to another lomdas Muktza, which is, I mentioned already, we need to think about Muktza as being about different types of functionality. So the chiddush of an object that's not, let's this is a really important question, so let's just step back for a few minutes. An item which is Muktza, the chiddush of the item being Muktza, is that it is not made for various uses. And we already said it can be not made for some uses and not other uses. It can be Muktza with respect to hana, but not Muktza with respect to movement. Now, a regular kli, according to how we husken, by definition of being a kli, is made for any use whatsoever. As soon as something is a kli, it's not muktzah, it's made for any use. People do sometimes put books on chairs. That's a use. So it's not MeHechano, it's just using a Keli for what it's used for. There is a minority opinion, and we will get to it later if we manage to get even this we will cover because there's a couple of stuff on. There is a minority opinion that even a klisha melachot laheta can be muktzah for irregular functionalities. But we don't paskin like that. Or we nearly don't paskin like that. We paskin a kli melachot laheta is mutter for any use, because that's what it means to be a kli that is only made for any use. I'll tell you, this particular piece of Torah is very chaviv, and because in my Sheva brachas, I spoke, one of the Sheva brachas asked me to give a shtickle Torah. There used to be an old minhag there. Chassanim gave shtickle Torah, and I was learning Beitzah at the time, which is Muktza. And I spoke about this very question of what the different flavors of what Muktza are. And but the chiddush of Kli Melachot Laheta is that it's only made for any use. Yes.
So on the point you just made in terms of that's why Rashi makes a big point about the bed being a cave.
Yes.
What you just said, because it has to be a kli, otherwise it couldn't be used for any use. That's why Rashi makes a big point to say the bed's
I think that there's a more basic reason why Rashi says it's a kli, because otherwise it couldn't be Mevatel kli MeHechano. Yeah. Yes.
The second one I was just going to touch on was just presumably this is an objective requirement of Mevatel kli MeHechano, because if you had a particular person who decided he puts the thing he uses the bed under the cobra, and he's in his mind he's decided I want it there the rest of Shabbat because I want to prevent this occurring. Would we say that doesn't matter? Because most people know that though it's there as a preventive method, if a better opportunity comes along, you'd want to bring it out again. It's not a problem.
Your scenarios where it's literally resting on it or it's not resting on it?
I'm agreeing with the scenario which you presented in terms of it must be very, very loose.
Yes.
Otherwise, if it's not so loose, I think it's Mevatel kli. It just seems by definition because you've been Mevatel that you can't use it. So it's got to be really loose. But even if your mind is saying, I want it there the rest of Shabbat, would that cause a problem? Or do you say, well,
I think you're right, and I don't think it would cause a problem. I think it's objective, more than subjective in this answer to the Gemara. Yeah.
Kids with the bed that's squashed into a corner right onto the smooth that make it unusable. Right? It's that Mevatel.
Define making it unusable. If you mean because it becomes Muktza and or a bossis, then yes, that would be Mevatel ki MeHechano. If it becomes unusable because you've destroyed the kli, that would be Shiur b'kelim. If it becomes unusable just because it's very hard to get access to it and it's very jammed in, then that would be nothing on Shabbos. That wouldn't have any halachic significance on Shabbos. We saw that seemingly the implication of Rashi, when he keeps on emphasizing that Mevatel kli MeHechano is because it becomes Muktza, is that there's some extraneous factor that makes it unusable that wouldn't be enough to make it Mevatel kli MeHechano. The kli is still Mukhan, it's just I happen not to be able to use it because there's something preventing me getting access to it. It's not Mevatel kli MeHechano to lock something into a cupboard and throw the key away. Let's say following scenario. I put a pot in a cupboard, I close the cupboard, and I lock and I throw the key away on Shabbos. Now, the only way I can now get access to the key is by smashing the doors of the cupboard, which is also to do on Shabbos. Is that Mevatel ki MeHechano? Absolutely not. Imagine I make something unmovable without making it a bossis. I rest something on top of something else, so that by lifting it off, I would move the Muktza item. So I can't move it on Shabbos, that's a halacha. But it's not Mevatel ki MeHechano, it's something extraneous stopping me doing it. It's the chiddush of Mevatel MeHechano is because I'm depurposing it, defunctionalizing it internally by making it Muktza. It is no longer Mevatel MeHechano. It is no longer muchen for its use. That's the only case where it would be Mevatel MeHechano. Okay, in this reading, what I am suggesting is that it is a bossis because it is resting, but it's not Mevatel MeHechano because I can unbossis it without a significant structural change. You could say a variant of this answer by arguing it isn't a bossis at all, by looking at Hilchos bossis. And these are the next two ways of saying this. You could say it's not a bossis because if something is partially resting on something, would that be a bossis at all? I mean, let me first of all say the following. Imagine I put the safsal, the bench or the bed posts, under the beam where it was in no contact with the beam at all. But it's a security device. I'm scared that the Korah will fall on Shabbos, so I put the safsal or the thing there, but it's 5 centimeters underneath the Korah. But that gives me the reassurance if the Korah begins falling, before it can build up too much speed, it will be propped up. So there I think everyone would agree it's not, everyone would agree it's not a bossis. There's no Mevatel MeHechano. Agreed? So now we can quibble, we can think about where it is resting, the beam is resting on the bed, but barely resting. Is that called a bossis at all? So again, with the egg case, an egg is a very light thing, but it's resting on the Kli. Without the Kli, the egg would fall. Whereas here, without the Kli, the beam wouldn't suddenly come crashing down. It would very, very slowly begin subsiding, may stay for a while and then tip. I may be nervous as it's going to fall. So is this called a bossis at all? It's a really interesting question. Hilchos bossis, something which is barely resting, is that called a bossis at all? So that's sort of along the similar line of thought. That I was thinking maybe the first answer I gave was it was a bossis because it is resting, but it's not Mevatel MeHechano as per similar svara to Tosfos. If you can unravel the bossis without any structural change, maybe that doesn't make it Mevatel MeHechano. The second thought is maybe it's not a bossis at all because it's barely resting. Maybe barely resting isn't called a bossis. Bossis is when something is completely resting. It's true that the beam net pressure may be more than the egg, which is a very little light object, but the egg as a little small entity is completely resting, and the beam is you can call it Zev, Zegoim, Sayea. It's just assisting the beam, but basically the bed is the beam would stay up without resting. There is I again, this wasn't my only idea. I saw someone quote a Chazon Ish. The Halacha L'maaseh, the Chazon Ish speaks about this and about this Gemara. He argues that something which is resting in something else, but you can, so object A, an egg resting in a cup. And if you can move the cup without any motion affecting the egg, that's not called resting. So if you have one object sitting on top of another object, but it's set up such that you can move the underlying object without any motion on the object that's sitting on top of it, that by definition is not a bossis. The point of bossis is it's resting on it. And he uses Al Gemara of Korah as the example of that. So the Chazon Ish doesn't fully explain how he's picturing the scenario of Korah. I think he's picturing something like what I'm saying, which is it's barely resting, it's in motion, it's preventative, something along those lines. And he says that the very definition of bossis is not when something is unable to move. It wouldn't move by removing it. The whole point of bossis is it's positioned there such that it would move if I move it. So that's the best attempt I had in this. As I said this, I just looked at the clock to see whether I could come on to the next line of Gemara. I saw that I've well shot over my time. So thanks to everyone for being such a polite audience. I'd like to think it was because the Shiur was so enjoyable. Many years ago, I gave a drasha in this very room, and it was Shabbos Chol HaMoed, and the Shir HaShirim hadn't yet turned up, and therefore the Gabbal asked me to speak at length, and I made the mistake of listening to them. I've since then become more experienced, and I think I spoke for about 24 minutes till I got a signal that the Shir HaShirim had turned up. Someone after me said, Rabbi, that was so good. So I timed it, you spoke for 24 minutes and it only felt like 23. So I got the message from that. But 65-minute drashas, let the Gabbal worry about no Megillah. So thanks to everyone for joining.